within our membership so they have information on how to write a good op-ed or a letter to the editor. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then start the recording. Alrighty.
Recording in progress.
Great. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I'm Jesper, and Dr. Obel, do you want to introduce yourself as well briefly?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Obel. I'm trained as a medical oncologist and came to oncology via journalism, working for the UN in Costa Rica. If there are people who are in their 50s, you'll remember what Latin America was like in the 1990s. I was there for a couple of years, and then I worked for ABC News as the assignment editor for Latin America and some local TV news stations, and then was drawn to medicine, worked in medicine. And when I was a resident, I had trouble with some of the situations I found myself in. And as a cathartic experience, I wrote articles for the Washington Post. And I wrote them because I needed a place to express what I was seeing, which is, I think, one of the things we're going to talk about. But I published with them, and then I became a spokesperson for the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and then moved into end-of-life care and end-of-life care research. So I think what's interesting when I look back at my evolution through medicine, I think my history in journalism really helped my career, because knowing how to write is essential when we're writing grants and when we're giving talks. So these skills that we're going to talk about, which is narrative writing and very different than research writing, actually makes anything you're writing for an email or to anyone else much stronger. So they're really general principles about how to write well. Without ChatGPT, but it does help.
ChatGPT does help a lot. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jenny. We're going to go ahead and move into our workshop. The goal of today's agenda is we're going to aim for a really tight 15 minutes or so of just talking at you what good principles are for op-ed writing. And then we're going to split off for about 10 to 15 minutes in smaller breakout rooms so that you can introduce yourselves to members of our op-ed team, talk about some ideas you have, and also for each of you to make connections with each other. Maybe you can be co-authors. Maybe you know people in respective states who can work with people on this call. And so we want to both crowdsource ideas, but also give some good starting points for where to go with an op-ed. Some quick acknowledgements. Thanks a lot to a lot of the physicians here on the slide who have helped build the resources, the slides, and have served as overall inspirations when it comes to op-ed writing for us on this team. We're really grateful for their support, and we also have no conflicts of interest to declare. So Jenny talked a bit about her background earlier. I tried to capture some of this in these pictures here of places she's written at. My background is that I'm currently a fourth-year medical student at University of Michigan. I was also born and raised in Michigan, and so got involved with Doctors for Biden back in 2020. Now I'm involved again with Doctors for Harris. Have written a couple op-eds myself, but I found the most joy in supporting other people and writing their pieces about patients, policies, and issues that they really care about. So really excited to have everyone here today. And I think with that, we're going to jump into the meat of the content. So I wanted to start off by sharing a couple quick points about why it's important to write op-eds and why they actually matter. The first point is that when you look at polls that are being done nationally about issues that voters care the most about, healthcare ranks pretty high up on them. A recent poll from Pew in May showed that 57% of voters care about healthcare affordability. And the only two issues that ranked above that were inflation and then bipartisanship. So healthcare was ranking even above things like gun safety, climate change, even immigration in terms of the border. I'm sure you'll get different numbers of different polls, but it's clear that voters care a lot about healthcare. In addition to that, there's a subset of voters that care a lot about particular healthcare issues. So 1 in 8 voters see abortion as the most important issue for them in this election. And that's a pretty large subset of voters. thinking about how we can really excite and activate those voters through sharing authentic voices from all of you who are clinicians and care for patients is going to be a key part of the strategy to voter turnout this year. And on that note, 93% of respondents in recent polls say that they trust their doctor when it comes to health information. So I think a lot of clinicians, including nurses, social workers, physicians, are people who the general public and patients trust a lot when it comes to talking about healthcare. When it comes to the op-eds, there's actually a really interesting study in a political science journal I read that was an experimental panel survey where they basically recruited people and then gave them op-eds to read, and then over time identified shifts in their opinion on target issues within those op-eds. And the study found that op-eds actually can shift people's opinion on these issues and do it for up to about a month, which is a pretty meaningful change. And so I get a lot of questions sometimes about, do op-eds matter? How do we even know if we can measure impact? There have been studies that I'm happy to share that actually show that people read op-eds and they care about them, whether they're policymakers or whether they're the general public and voters. This slide is for many of you who are familiar with academic writing. As you can see here, these are bubbles for what do audiences look like for different outlets. So down the bottom right, we have the biggest healthcare outlets. We have New England Journal of Medicine. On the top left, we have JAMA, Annals of Internal Medicine. These outlets at most have maybe readership of a couple million a year. But then you start looking at not only national outlets like the New York Times, but even local outlets like the Minneapolis Star Tribune, or outlets like the St. Paul Pioneer Press in Minnesota. These outlets still get greater readership and target a more general audience than medical journals do. And that's what a lot of the value, I think, for op-eds can be, because our goal with our initiative is to drive shifts in opinion and impacts in opinion among voters who really matter, ideally in battleground states. That's like where we're really looking at, but we're also looking to publish nationally as well. So now we're going to dive a bit more into what are the good principles of writing a successful op-ed or letter to the editor. And we'll spend about the next 10 to 15 minutes discussing this with you all. So the first principle to think about is, how do you prepare to write an op-ed? What do you think about if you're like, I want to write an op-ed, I'm excited. What is the preparation I need to do? The first thing we recommend is that you take some time to read good op-eds first. We will share a list of this after, but there's a very particular tone to how op-eds are written that is very different from academic publications. It's for a much more general audience, it's a lot more personal, and a lot more specific in terms of the examples that you share. Reading good op-ed examples is a great way for you to figure out the tone of how to approach your op-ed. The second is for you to pick a topic that you really care and know about. Sure, there's a lot of important issues that voters think about, but we want you to write about issues that you can really speak to yourself in your practice. Maybe you're an OB-GYN, you care for patients who are thinking about IVF. Maybe you're an IM doctor, your patient's asking you about IVF. Maybe they're asking you about something like access to health insurance. The issues that you can speak to personally are going to be the most compelling stories to share with readers, and are going to be the most likely to be seen as valuable perspectives that op-ed editors want to accept and publish. Because you can spend a lot of time on an op-ed, but if no one is accepting it, then no one's going to be able to see that viewpoint. And to that point, it's really important to share topics that are timely. You might find an issue very important to you that you want to write about, such as protecting our democracy. That's a very big issue a lot of our members care about. But if you don't have like a news hook, you don't have a compelling issue in the moment to publish about, the op-ed editor is going to ask you, why should I publish this now? It's not about should I publish this, it's why should I publish this right now when I have 50 other people in my inbox who are telling me that they have an op-ed on some interesting topic. So think about, as you write, and especially if you're trying to write right now, what is some recent thing that happened, like policy that was passed, a debate that happened, the Democratic National Convention, that you can write about and you can relate to your piece?
And I'd like to say, and the time cycle is very short. So when you want to react to something, you have to have your op-ed written in 24 hours and out there. It's really important to be timely to that event. If you have an idea that you're thinking about and you see an event, that's even better. But that time cycle is very short. We know how journalist is. It's except for Biden, that took 3 weeks. But it's usually there's an event, then you see op-eds for a day, then they move on to the next event, and then there's op-eds. So I think that's a very important point to think about.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Jenny. I think, exactly. We totally agree with that. And I think the last few points wanted to share are thinking about how to articulate your argument and consider your audience. So this is thinking about who are you writing for? Obviously, you're writing for a more general audience, but what are you trying to convey to them, and what is the point you're trying to share? Think of when we talk about topics or op-eds, I usually encourage authors to think about what is your one-line statement. It's kind of like presenting a patient. I'm sure that many people can relate to that. What is your one-liner for your op-ed? What is the main takeaway? For example, my op-ed is a personal perspective about the importance of access to reproductive care as seen through the lens of my patients who I take care of in Alabama. That's like a one-liner for what are you trying to convey in your op-ed? Or maybe your op-ed is, I want to convey the importance through personal and patient anecdotes of the importance of alleviating medical debt for our patients through who we pick in this upcoming election. So really think about what is your one-liner and who is the audience that's you're targeting it to, because I think it really helps you figure out how to tailor your piece better. And then the final thing here is thinking about what are your target outlets. We recommend you think first state versus national. Our team can help you think about specific outlets, but if you are in a battleground state, or you know someone in a battleground state, or you have ties to a battleground state, we really encourage you to think about outlets there or targeting a state focus there. This is places like Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Michigan. There's many states that are going to be critical to winning the election this year. And the more we can get your voices out in those states to those audiences, the bigger impact we can have.
And also you'll have a higher likelihood of getting published in your state because you'll be Dr. X from X state. Another thing is you think that your institution might not support you, but they may. So I always would, before you publish an op-ed, let your institution know and ask them if they will allow you to use your institution in your byline. Because it's free press for the institution. So many of the times when I was writing, they always allowed me to use Northwestern Hospital because it was in the Washington Post. So even though it's political, I think it's fair to talk to your PR department and ask. And if they let you use an institutional name, that gives you even greater expertise.
Great. And I'm going to pass it to you again, Jenny, for some additional points that you have to share from your expertise at op-eds.
So I think it's important when you think about what you're writing about to think that we're all doing this together. And you may have a great idea about what's happening in Alabama, that internists are leaving, and you're seeing your friends flee Alabama because there's no abortion. But that's going to be best said from the doctor leaving Alabama. So not just ourselves as writers, but think of who you know who may be going through a pivotal point in this political cycle and encourage them to write, and then you can support them because those are going to be published. The most important op-ed is the one that gets published, not the one that gets written and passed over. And that's what I'm talking about, teaming up to get the message out.
Do you want food now?
I think we all want to be in the New York Times. If you're a liberal person and you read the New York Times every day, that's our dream. But you'll be published more. The likelihood of you being published will be more in your local paper because you represent a doctor locally with a local view. So don't write off, if I'm in Chicago, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune. Those are your greatest chances. You need to have more than just this support opposition statement when you're doing it. You can actually dig deeply into a topic. It doesn't have to be just one finite point. You can expand and bring in other points while you're writing an op-ed. Don't feel like it has to be so narrowly crafted. And I think another important thought is just to make sure you have your own voice and your own passion. And no matter who edits it, you remain sincere to your way of speaking and your thought process. And then it's no longer your op-ed.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. We'll have some specific examples later of what that language looks like in terms of what to do in an op-ed and what not to do. I'll take a moment to talk a bit about some tips for writing and then would love Jenny to hear your thoughts as well here. So a couple of points that we're going to share. In terms of starting to write, the hardest thing is starting. And I think a lot of people feel a little dissuaded, feeling like they have to write a 600 to 800 word piece from scratch. But honestly, you don't have to do that. Just start with an outline, even if it's 5 bullet points. What are the 5 things you want to talk about? What is it going to be in your intro? Is it going to be a patient story? Is it going to be a personal story? Is it going to be a news hook? What are going to be your 2 or 3 body paragraphs about the supporting evidence you want to provide? Are you going to bring them some statistics about like access to reproductive care? Are you going to talk about a recent news story in another state of like a success story for a policy that you're interested in? And then finally, what is your conclusion going to look like? How are you going to circle back to your beginning and wrap things up clearly? So really think about your outline and think about your hook. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but you want a really punchy hook statement, opening statement. I'm curious, Jenny, if you have any tips on thinking about that and the importance of the hook.
So it's that first line, and you can use humor. You can use a patient story. You can use anything that will bring and draw interest. But it's never, I am Dr. Jennifer Obel, and I have this idea. You have to come up with a narrative, descriptive, moving first sentence, because that's what's going to draw your reader in and your editor in. The easiest way to get published is to utilize your expertise. So if you are an oncologist, I can get published on anything on that field. So make sure when you're writing that it is an area that you own. So if you think about George Clooney's op-ed, he raised $25 million for Biden. He had, fame, but an expertise as a big fundraiser. So really think about, how are you an expert? When you do your credibility, it really is in your byline. You'll say that, I was a White House doctor, but the byline is going to establish your credibility more than you need. You do not need to spend a paragraph on that. 600 words is really short. We think it's long, but it's not. So try to move very quickly into your theme with anecdotes and evidence and powerful writing to make your point. Make the writing beautiful, and then it can get published.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I think that really covers a lot of the other points we have here, which are thinking about how are you articulating the evidence that is supporting you, as well as any counter arguments that exist. In a way, I think, Jenny described this to me earlier, it's not too dissimilar from writing a research paper. The difference is like the tone. The difference is how you're tailoring to your audience. You're not using formal jargon anymore. You're thinking about what are the anecdotes and stories you can really connect to a compelling point you want to make to your audience.
And I think it's about being human. In an op-ed, you are allowed to express your feelings, your horror, your compassion, and the more you show your human side, I think it adds to it. And also, of course, your expertise. But I don't think it can't look like a research paper. That's not what they want. They want a voice and an expert novel opinion. If you can say something that no one's thought of, which there always is a new way of thinking of something, it will get published. So it's basically, are you an expert? Is this novel? And is your writing tight? And the editor does not want to have to work hard. So if you send them a great op-ed that's 1,500 words, it will not get published, because that editor needs to put it in the next day and they don't have the time to cut it. So stay within the word count, and you don't want them to have to do too much work. They want an op-ed that's perfect and goes to press that day, because that's how the news cycle works.
Great. I think on the note of writing, I wanted to give a few examples of what to do and what not to do using examples that I wrote myself. So we're not putting anyone on blast here, like I put this together. This is an example of what we think you should avoid. So Here I wrote, watching the first State of the Union address by President Biden, I heard about his plans for healthcare. He shared many ideas that are exciting to me, including capping the price of insulin and expanding healthcare coverage. As Jenny said earlier, the key with a first statement is really to hook people in. You want something interesting. Maybe it's like an anecdote. Maybe it's like an interesting statement. Maybe it's something that connects to the news cycle. But you want that to be very clear to the reader. Second line I have here is, as a doctor, let me tell you why I support President Biden's agenda for healthcare and why you should too. To Jenny's point earlier, it's not enough to just say that you're a physician and that you have this point about a particular politician or candidate. You have to articulate why this really matters and why does it matter that you are a doctor speaking on this issue. What is the topic area that you own here that makes your point compelling to the reader? And the final paragraph here says, President Biden's plan is to increase access to affordable medications for patients. On the other hand, Trump is busy finding ways to limit access to reproductive care and cut people off from Medicaid. This has highly negative impacts on care access for patients. I'm going to show you in the next example. You really want to show, you don't want to tell. If you spend too much of your op-ed just telling the reader what you think they should believe, that's not as compelling as sharing your personal experience. I've often been told when I write, no one can really invalidate your personal experience, although they can
Right.
invalidate your opinions. I'm curious, Jenny, what you think about that.
I think that's perfect. I mean, that's the key of writing, telling, not showing, which too many people do. You really want to draw the picture for the reader. I agree with that completely.
And so here's like a revised version, still not perfect, but I think a little better than before. Now here we have President Joe Biden in his first State of the Union laid out a sweeping plan for the new normal under the pandemic, with healthcare affordability as one of its centerpieces. I still think this can be an even better hook, but I think what we're trying to illustrate here is that there's a very clear statement that links to something interesting and relevant to the reader in the news cycle. Next paragraph. As healthcare providers, we know that the president's plan to close the Medicaid coverage gap and make healthcare premium subsidies more available would make a huge difference for our patients, especially amid an unpredictable pandemic and rising inflation. So here, still connecting back to your background as a doctor, but you're illustrating here why this matters. What is your expertise and ownership here? And it's that you know that your patients are going to benefit from these specific policies that you see President Biden pushing for. The last paragraph here says, in the emergency department, we've seen countless patients struggle to afford healthcare coverage, risking their lives as a result. Take, for example, John. He had been diagnosed with a blood clot and needed to stay in the hospital. Despite that, John resisted as he explained that his employer did not offer health insurance and he could not stay the night. So here, this is what I'm trying to say about showing and not telling. The previous example we gave just said, President Biden's plan is going to help improve access to healthcare coverage. This is really an example here that shows what are the stakes of that healthcare coverage for patients like yours. The more examples, the more specifics, the more anecdotes you can give, I think the more that illustrates to the reader the stakes of what you're talking about. But also, it's very unique. To Jenny's point, people like op-ed editors want to hear unique perspectives. And I think your experiences all here on the call are extremely unique and things that we need to hear more about. Because honestly, we're not hearing enough clinician voices out in op-ed media in the news. Curious, Jenny,
I have a couple of points. When you write, look at every single word you have on the page. Is it necessary? Does it enhance your statement? Like you take, for example, John. We don't need that there. We can just say, John had been diagnosed with a blood clot and needed to stay in the hospital. When you're writing, make sure your sentence structures are different. Some people tend to write in passive voice the whole time. You really want to vary the way your sentences are. Short sentences, longer sentences, punchy sentences. Did you use a semicolon? Did you use a hyphen? Really think about it as art. When we think about art, there's so much going on in a painting, and you want to vary the sentence structure to make it more interesting to the reader and never use the same tempo. Even an incomplete sentence can work in an op-ed in its own right. So I think that's something, I do think short sentences, long sentences, and make sure every sentence matters and every word matters. And there always can be a stronger word for each word you write. Once you write it out, rewrite the sentence. How can I make this stronger? And that's that rewriting process that is key to being published, because it's never the first draft. It's never the second. It's never the third. And I also think use your friends. Let them read it. They could read your draft and say, I don't like the writing, but your idea is terrific. I would go in this direction. But use the people you know to read this over and over again. And then it'll become stronger and stronger with each input that you have.
Yep. And to that point, we actually have an op-ed team that can support you as you put together your op-ed outline, your draft, and think about pitching. And some of you may already be in touch with some of our op-ed team members, and we'd love to get in touch with the rest of you as you start to come up with your ideas. I just wanted to add a quick addendum here. We talk a lot about op-eds. There's another great option to get your voice out, and it's a letter to the editor. Many of you have seen these in your local newspapers. This one on the right is an example in the Columbus Dispatch from one of our members a couple of years ago. And what I find with letters to the editors, first of all, they're very easy to write. It's less than 150 words. So the challenge is figuring out what to cut more than what to put in. But these also have a better chance of acceptance. I find that newspaper editors tend to be less strict about the tone you take in a letter to the editor. So if you want to write a piece that all you say is that I'm a doctor and I think Trump is a terrible candidate and he's bad for our democracy and health, you can do that in a letter to the editor and they would happily publish that. That type of tone would probably go over less well in an op-ed unless you had a very unique perspective on why you don't support Trump. Like to Jenny's point, maybe you are a former high-profile Republican lawyer who worked in the Trump administration and you no longer support Trump. That's a compelling viewpoint that the op-ed letter editor would publish. But just to say that you have a stance for or against a candidate and that you're a physician is not enough to get an op-ed published. It may be enough to get a letter to the editor published. Jenny, curious if you have any other thoughts there.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. And while we are talking about the election, this also raises our profile as caring physicians. The more we write, I mean, we all know Atul Gawande, Newland wrote How We Die. There's been more and more writer MDs, and I think we can think about it as a way to represent our field in a more humanistic way. So this is about COVID, but I would encourage everyone, when you see something and you want to write about it, try it. You know, I think they have a good chance of getting in as a letter to the editor.
Great. All right. And as promised, I think that pretty much wraps up the didactic portion. I want to talk a bit about pitching, how our team can support you, and then we're going to take a few minutes in breakout rooms just to talk and introduce ourselves and talk about ideas. So when it comes to pitching, this is something I won't talk too much about because when you are ready to pitch, you should reach out to our team and we will offer support for you. I know it's a very confusing process to know how to go about pitching to authors or op-ed editors. But as you think, the main thing for you to think about is really, are you thinking state or are you thinking national? And if you're in a battleground state, we would strongly encourage you to consider state level pieces. There's a lot of good outlets out there. We have some connections to a couple of them at the national level. The state level, it's more we find their information, we pitch to them. But once you're ready, you'll reach out to us. We'll give some ideas on where to pitch. We'll put together a pitch email for you. And then you'll submit your piece to that editor. Give it a couple days, see what happens. If you don't hear back, we'll send a reminder to them, and then you can follow up with a different outlet. That's usually how we go about it. And I just wanted to flag for everyone here, if you've written the op-ed and you haven't had success pitching to a couple outlets, we actually have a Medium page for Doctors for Harris that we can publish your piece on and amplify to our 15,000 followers on social media. So just know that if you're struggling to find a home for the piece, we'll make sure it gets published somewhere, and we'll make sure that we're sharing your piece out to all of our followers on social media. So your work is not going to be for naught. Great. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we can do to help you. And then we're going to spend some time discussing your ideas in our breakout rooms. So what we can do to help you. We have a team of about 5 or 6 people who are experienced with op-ed editing. If you want to work with our team, if you have an outline, you have a draft, then please send that to me. My email is here. I'll follow up afterward as well. And I will work to pair you with a member of our team who can help support you with your op-ed. This might be helping edit your draft. It might be giving you ideas for where to pitch. It might be pairing you with other authors if you feel like you're worried about writing on your own and it's too much work. And please, please, please reach out to us if you are in a battleground state or if you know someone you could co-author with who is in a battleground state. As long as one person is in that state, it's fine if not all the authors are from that state. You just need one person who can pitch that piece who's in that state. And again, really seeing how close this election might be in these battleground states, we want to get your voices out in these places.
A lot of these op-eds that you're writing, they have a form, and they actually, you can pitch it, but they actually want the fully submitted piece. So if you look at the New York Times, the Washington Post, there's a form that you go to. They tell you what their guidelines are. They give you advice on what gets published, but then they actually tend to want the whole piece. It's because it's 600 words. They just want you to submit the piece to them. So I think I would consider it pitched to us, but then you're going to end up submitting the entire piece to the newspaper or outlet.
Exactly. And I think on that note, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you some next steps to think about. We're going to split into breakout rooms. And then once the breakout rooms are over, that's the end of today's workshop. You don't need to hop back into the main room. Want to keep this within the 45 minutes. So again, next steps. Think about a piece you want to write and think about if there's someone you want to write it with, especially in target states. Send us questions, ideas, and outlines to my email. And then join us in our breakout rooms for the next few minutes to talk with members about our team about your ideas. On that note, I'm going to stop the recording.
Recording stopped.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop up our discussion questions, which I'll share with our facilitators. And then Avery, if you can go ahead and put us in breakout rooms, we'll have a chance to chat.